My husband forgot to hang up the call with me, and I heard him telling someone, "Our marriage is awful, but I'm only with her because of her family's money." I didn't drop the phone. I didn't scream. I didn't breathe. I sat perfectly still on the edge of our bed, staring at the wall like it could give me an explanation. His voice came through the speaker again, careless and too honest. "Her dad's loaded, man. You think I'd still be in this if there wasn't a trust fund behind it?" The other voice laughed, low and muffled, like they were speaking over drinks. "So you're just gonna ride it out?" There was a pause. Then he said it, calmly, like he was proud of the math he'd done. 2 more years, maybe 3. Then I'll have enough to walk. She won't even see it coming. She's too comfortable. I ended the call. My hand didn't shake. That would come later. In that moment, I stared down at the screen like it had just delivered a death sentence. In a way, it had. Not of a person, but of a version of my life I thought was real. 3 years of marriage unraveled in seconds. Every late-night conversation, every laugh, every fight we'd smoothed over with apologies. Now a rehearsed performance. I sat back, letting the weight of what I'd heard settle like dust in my lungs. The betrayal didn't come with screaming or crying. It came with silence. An eerie, hollow quiet where my heartbeat felt too loud. I opened the drawer where I kept our wedding photos. There was one we both loved. A candid of us laughing in the rain, soaked, ridiculous, alive. I used to think that moment was real. Now I wondered if he'd already been calculating then. If he'd seen the daughter of a successful businessman and not the person standing next to him. I remembered our engagement, how fast it moved, how he'd charmed my family. My dad, always cautious, had taken longer to warm up to him. But eventually, even he said, "He seems solid." I remembered how proud my mom was, saying, "You picked someone with good instincts." Had I? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay beside the man who'd just confirmed he didn't love me, who saw our marriage as a temporary investment. His breathing was steady, peaceful. I wondered if he knew how loud that silence felt from my side of the bed. The next morning, I acted normal. I made coffee, just like I always did. He came downstairs in sweatpants, kissed the top of my head, told me I smelled good. "Sleep okay?" he asked. I smiled. "Yeah, you?" "Like a rock," he said, pouring his usual half cup, no sugar. "You working from home today?" I nodded. "Just a few calls." I watched him from across the kitchen, the way he leaned on the counter, scrolling through his phone. I noticed everything now. The way he glanced at our shared calendar, how he tapped on a notification and quickly swiped it away. I didn't ask what it was. I'd stopped wanting to know. When he left, I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and stared at a blank document. I was supposed to be reviewing contracts. Instead, I opened a note and wrote down what I heard on that call, word for word. I needed it preserved. Not for court. For myself. Because I knew there'd be days ahead when I'd doubt what I heard. Question if I was overreacting, convince myself to stay. That note would remind me I wasn't crazy. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house but didn't go inside. I sat in the car, engine off, staring at the front porch. I couldn't bring it to them. Not yet. My dad would ask for proof. My mom would blame herself. And I couldn't handle their pain on top of my own. I went back home before he did. Lit a candle. Put on soft music. Made dinner. When he walked in, he smiled like he always did. Said, "Smells amazing in here." Kissed my cheek. Told me he missed me. I smiled back. "I missed you too." That night, we ate together. He told me about a pitch meeting that went well. Said someone was interested in his startup idea. I asked questions. Played supportive. I knew he was hoping for a buy-in from my father eventually. That was always the unspoken goal. After dinner, he poured wine and turned on the fireplace. We watched a movie I didn't care about. He pulled me close. I let him. Not because I wanted to. Because I needed to map the routine. Every moment of intimacy. Every practiced move. I had to see it all clearly if I was going to unravel it. I went to bed before him. Told him I was tired. He said he'd be up soon. I stared at the ceiling again, letting his words echo. Too comfortable. She won't see it coming. I saw it. And I wouldn't stay comfortable for long. I saw it. And I wouldn't stay comfortable for long. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. It wasn't that I couldn't sleep. It was that I didn't want to. The bed felt foreign. His presence beside me, the rise and fall of his chest, his fingers slightly grazing my arm. These things used to anchor me. Now they made my skin itch. I slipped out quietly, showered in silence, and stared at my reflection for a long time. It was strange how ordinary I looked. No one would have guessed what I knew. No one would have suspected that Less than 48 hours ago, I'd overheard my husband calculating his exit strategy from the marriage he helped build. Not because it wasn't working, not because we'd grown apart, but because I came attached to money. In the kitchen, I started making coffee before realizing I didn't want any. I poured the water anyway. The motions grounded me. When he came downstairs, hair wet from his own shower, wearing the same navy sweatshirt he always did on work-from-home days, I kept my expression neutral. "You're up early," he said, yawning. "Didn't sleep great. Too much wine last night?" I smiled faintly. "Maybe." He kissed the top of my head. I flinched. Not noticeably, but enough that I felt it. He didn't seem to. Or maybe he'd grown so used to my compliance that he didn't notice anything unless it disrupted his script. After breakfast, I sat at the kitchen island, laptop open, calendar full of meetings I had no intention of joining. I stared at the screen while my mind wandered. 3 years. That's how long we'd been married. Almost exactly. And somehow, in less than 3 minutes of overheard audio, I was being forced to reassess every moment of it. Was he lying when he said I looked beautiful in the mornings? When he cried at our wedding, was it real or just good acting? When he talked about kids, was that part of the plan too? Build deeper ties? Make it harder to walk away? Harder to untangle the money? I thought about our first year together, the small apartment we rented downtown, the way we'd save up for takeout and share cheap wine on the fire escape. I'd believed in us then. In him. I remember telling my sister, "He's the kind of man who makes the world feel solid." And maybe that was true, until the foundation cracked. At noon, I stepped away from my computer and sat on the edge of the bed. I let myself go back through it all. Slowly. Deliberately. I wanted to see it clearly, to stop idealizing it. I needed to strip away the warm filters I'd built around our memories and see them for what they really were. Like the way he always insisted we dine at high-end restaurants whenever we were with my parents. The way he got quiet anytime money came up, unless it involved something being gifted to us. How he once told me it made more sense to lease a new car in my name since my credit was stronger. At the time, I'd called it practicality. Now I saw it for what it was. He hadn't fallen out of love. He'd never actually been in it. I picked up my phone and opened our photos. There were hundreds. Vacations, birthdays, selfies in the kitchen. I zoomed in on his expression in one, his arm around me, smiling, perfectly posed. And yet his eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking just past the lens, as if he was already aiming for whatever came next. I saved a few of the more recent pictures. Not for nostalgia, for documentation. I had a strange, sharp instinct to start gathering things. Like a woman preparing for a storm no one else could see coming. By evening, I felt numb. He was in the living room, working on something he called a pitch deck for investors. He didn't offer details. He never did. Not to me. He asked what I wanted for dinner. I told him I wasn't hungry. He offered to cook anyway. Said, "Let me take care of you." I watched him move around the kitchen, humming to himself. It was the same song he always hummed, some old indie track he used to play when we first dated. I wondered if he hummed it for her, too. I didn't ask. I didn't speak much at all that night, but I took note of everything. The way he watched me from the corner of his eye. The way he hesitated before bringing the food over. Almost like he sensed something had shifted. When he finally sat beside me, he said, "You've been quiet. Just tired. Work stress?" Something like that. He nodded and placed a hand on my thigh. I didn't move, didn't flinch this time. I was too far beneath the surface, too deep in the place where grief quietly transforms into clarity, because that's what was happening now. I wasn't breaking down. I was waking up. And now, every move he made became a study, a performance I'd watched too many times without realizing I was the audience. It had been 3 days since the phone call. 3 days of watching him brush his teeth, make coffee, kiss my cheek goodbye, all while knowing what he'd said about me, about us. The strange thing was how normal he seemed. Not guilty, not careful, just ordinary. Maybe that was the most unsettling part, that someone could plan your betrayal and still sleep soundly beside you. Thursday morning, he offered to drive me to work, something he hadn't done in months. "You look tired," he said, adjusting his rearview mirror. "Figured I'd make your morning easier." I almost said yes. The old me would have been touched by the gesture. Now I wondered what prompted it. Was this part of the routine? Keep the wife happy, keep the money flowing? "I have a stop to make after work," I said instead. "I'll drive myself." He nodded easily. "No problem. Dinner out tonight? That steakhouse you like? The one my father recommended? the one we'd been to exactly twice, both times when my parents were paying. Sure, I said. At work, I couldn't concentrate. Every email felt pointless. Every meeting dragged. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to remember his exact tone when he'd said, "She won't see it coming." Casual, almost bored, like discussing the weather. During lunch, I sat in my car and called my sister. Not to tell her everything, I wasn't ready for that, but just to hear a familiar voice. "You sound weird," she said after 5 minutes of small talk. "Everything okay?" "Just tired. Work stuff. How's the husband?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. "He's fine, same as always." That doesn't sound convincing. I forced a laugh. "I'm just in a weird mood. Ignore me." But after we hung up, I sat there thinking about her words. Same as always. That was the problem, wasn't it? He was exactly the same. While my entire world had shifted, he remained unchanged. Because for him, nothing had shifted. This was always the plan. That evening at dinner, he ordered wine without asking what I wanted, made a toast to us and the future we're building. "Do you ever think," he said, cutting into his steak, "about what we want our life to look like in 5 years?" I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" "Just bigger things, you know? Your family has this amazing foundation, this network. Sometimes I think we could be doing more with it." The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced this conversation. More like what? I don't know. Partnerships, investments, building something that lasts. He was testing the waters, seeing how receptive I was to involving my family's money in his plans. "That's pretty vague," I said. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I guess I'm still figuring it out. Just feels like we have so many opportunities we're not taking advantage of." Later that night, I watched him sleep. His breathing was steady, peaceful. No signs of guilt or worry. Just a man resting after a productive day of manipulation. I lay awake until almost 3 in the morning, not thinking about revenge or confrontation, just trying to understand how I'd missed it. How someone could share a bed with you, share meals, share conversations about the future, all while planning to leave you once they'd extracted enough value. The next morning, I decided to pay attention differently. Not to snoop or investigate, not yet, but to really see him. To stop filling in the gaps with my own hopes and assumptions. When he said, "I love you," before leaving for work, I watched his eyes. They looked just past me, unfocused, like he was reading from a script. When he texted me at lunch, "Thinking of you, beautiful," I noticed he sent it at exactly the same time he'd texted me yesterday, and the day before. When he came home that evening with flowers from the grocery store, I realized he'd done the same thing last month. Same flowers, same timing, same casual "saw these and thought of you." It wasn't spontaneous affection, it was maintenance. That night, over leftover takeout, he asked about my day with the same interested expression he always wore. But when I mentioned a problem with a client, he nodded and immediately changed the subject to his own work. He hadn't actually been listening, just waiting for his turn to talk. These weren't new behaviors. They'd always been there. I'd just been too willing to see love where there was only routine. By Sunday, I felt like I was living with a stranger. Not because he'd changed, but because I finally saw him clearly. The man I'd fallen in love with had been a carefully constructed character. And the performance was so polished, so consistent, that even he seemed to believe in it. That afternoon, while he watched a game in the living room, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't want and started making a mental list. Not of evidence or proof, just of things I'd noticed. Things that suddenly made sense. How he always suggested expensive restaurants when my parents were joining us. How he'd grown quiet whenever I mentioned wanting to help pay down his student loans. How his business ideas always seemed to require connections my father could provide. How he'd pushed for a joint bank account within 6 months of marriage. None of it was dramatic. None of it was obvious. That's what made it so effective. I wasn't dealing with a villain. I was dealing with someone who'd turned our entire relationship into a long-term business strategy. And he was so good at it, he probably didn't even see it as betrayal. Just smart planning. By Monday, the performance resumed, like clockwork. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work, said, "Don't work too hard," with a soft smile. I stood in the hallway, watching him gather his keys, adjust his jacket, and walk out like he had somewhere important to be. He didn't know I already suspected most of his meetings weren't real. That morning, I began documenting things. Not dramatic evidence, just details. I created a private note on my phone and titled it Observations. It wasn't meant to be legal or admissible. It was for me. to remind myself when I started doubting that none of this was in my head. Tuesday, 12:47 p.m. Thinking of you text. Same time as yesterday. Use joint card for online consultation service. $145. Not discussed. Restaurant suggestion for next week. One my father mentioned during last family dinner. They weren't smoking guns. But together, they painted a picture. And I was learning to read it. I started paying attention to the finances, not by hacking passwords or digging through his files, but by watching habits. He always offered to pay for dinners when we were with friends, but used the joint card. He'd get vague when I brought up budgeting. And anytime I talked about scaling back on spending, he redirected the conversation. By Wednesday, I noticed something new. Panic. Barely beneath the surface. He came home early, which he never did midweek, and said he just wanted to spend time with me. I was polite, surprised, but not warm. He picked up on it. You seem off lately, he said, watching me too closely. Just tired. Is it work? Us? Mostly work. I smiled gently. Nothing you did. It wasn't entirely a lie. He hadn't done anything new. He was simply continuing what he'd been doing since the beginning. I had just started seeing it. That night, I made a subtle shift. I casually mentioned that my dad was changing some things in the family business. Restructuring, reallocating. I didn't elaborate. Just let it hang. He looked up from his drink. Is everything okay with him? Probably. He's just being careful lately. I watched the flash of concern in his eyes, masked quickly with a nod. He always thinks 10 steps ahead, he said. I gave a small smile. It runs in the family. The next day he asked if I wanted to go away for the weekend. Just us. Cabin up north. Somewhere quiet. I almost laughed. A sudden romantic getaway wasn't his style. Not unless he needed something. Maybe next weekend, I said. I have a few things I need to take care of first. He didn't push. But that night, he was more affectionate than usual. Held me longer. Watched me while I read. Tried to initiate a conversation about long-term goals, using phrases like real estate, a retirement, generational wealth. I listened quietly. The truth was, I didn't know what my long-term goal was yet. All I knew was that it no longer included him. By Friday, I made a decision. I wouldn't wait for a perfect moment. I wouldn't wait for more evidence or for him to slip up. I'd already seen enough. And I didn't need a full plan. I just needed to start pulling away, strategically, calmly, without giving him reason to panic. I began with my accounts. Not the joint ones, mine. The personal savings I hadn't touched since college. I scheduled an appointment with my bank manager. Requested that a new account be opened in my name only, no digital trace linking to him. I moved a modest amount, enough to start a separation, not enough to trigger suspicion. That weekend, I visited my parents under the pretense of helping them organize paperwork for tax season. I didn't tell them the truth, not yet. But I asked a lot of questions, casual ones, about legal protections, about the trust, about how they vet people tied to the family business. My dad gave me a look across the kitchen table. Something on your mind? I shook my head, just being cautious. He didn't push. He never did. That was something I'd always loved about him. He gave people space to come to him when they were ready. Saturday night, back home, he brought up the idea of us starting a business together. He said it casually, but I could tell he'd been rehearsing it. We've got the brand, the last name, the connections. All we need is the right concept. What kind of concept? I asked. I'm thinking wellness, he said. Something lifestyle-focused. Everyone's into that now. Do you have experience in that space? Not yet. But with the right team, the right pitch, your dad might even know someone. I let him trail off. I didn't nod. I didn't push. I just looked at him. And for the first time, I didn't see my husband. I saw the plan, the calculation, the person behind the mask. And he was starting to sweat. It showed in small ways. He'd started checking his phone more often, even when we were talking, glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The easy confidence from our early years had developed hairline cracks. Sunday morning, I mentioned that my family was going through a quiet financial reorganization. I said it while stirring my tea, not looking at him. Casual, measured. Is that serious? He asked immediately. Not really, I replied. Just tightening a few things. My dad's getting stricter about how assets are managed. He nodded slowly. Makes sense. Smart move. But I noticed he didn't touch his coffee after that. And when I excused myself to take a call from my sister, I heard the floorboards creaking in the kitchen, pacing. That evening, He was overly attentive, made dinner without being asked, lit candles, asked me what kind of vacation I'd want if we just ran away for a while. Somewhere quiet, I said. No signal, just air and space. He smiled like that meant I was still his, but the smile looked tired around the edges. Monday morning, I started researching. Nothing dramatic, just information gathering. I looked up financial consultants online, read reviews, bookmarked contact information. I researched storage facilities. I Googled phrases like financial manipulation in marriage and protecting assets during separation. I wasn't ready to act on any of it, but knowledge felt like armor. That afternoon, while he was at what he called a client meeting, I walked through our house differently. Not snooping, just noticing. The way he'd positioned his laptop so the screen faced away from the common areas. How he'd started keeping his phone face down during meals. The stack of business cards on his desk that hadn't been there last week. When he came home, he seemed agitated. Said the meeting didn't go as planned, but wouldn't elaborate. Over dinner, he pitched an idea for an app focused on financial literacy for couples. People trust people with legacy, he said, gesturing with his fork. If we position ourselves as a team building wealth together, there's something there. He always used words like we and team when talking about money, but only my family's money. Tuesday, I did something small but deliberate. I changed my banking password. Just mine. The personal account he'd never had access to anyway. It wasn't that I thought he was monitoring it, but I wanted to start drawing invisible lines. That evening, he suggested dinner out. Said he'd made a reservation somewhere special. The restaurant was nice, too nice for a random Tuesday. When we arrived, the hostess greeted us warmly, but I caught her glancing at him with a look I couldn't quite read. Familiarity, maybe, or confusion. During dinner, he was more animated than usual, talking about opportunities and building something lasting. But underneath the enthusiasm, I sensed something else. An urgency that hadn't been there before. I've been thinking, he said, cutting into his steak. We should be more intentional about our financial future. Maybe bring your dad into some conversations about investments. There it was. The real reason for the nice dinner, the candles, the sudden romance. That's pretty vague, I said. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. I guess I'm still figuring out the specifics. Wednesday, I told him I'd be working late. Instead, I drove around for 2 hours thinking. I sat in a coffee shop and made lists in my head. Not evidence lists, just clarity lists. What I knew, what I suspected, what I needed to understand. When I got home, he was waiting up. Said he'd been worried. Asked if everything was okay with my family, with work, with us. Everything's fine, I said. Just busy. He studied my face like he was trying to read something written there. You'd tell me if something was wrong, right? He asked. I met his gaze. Of course. It was the first outright lie I'd told him since this began, and it felt surprisingly easy. Thursday morning, he was restless. Made coffee, then didn't drink it. Started conversations, then trailed off mid-sentence. Finally, he asked if I was feeling weird energy between us. Not particularly, I said. Why? He shrugged. Just feels like something's shifted. I looked at him. Really looked. At the man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years. The man who'd cried at our wedding. Who'd held my hand through my grandmother's funeral. Who'd apparently been calculating our expiration date since the beginning. Maybe you're just stressed, I said. He nodded slowly. Maybe. But we both knew it wasn't stress. It was the sound of a house of cards beginning to tremble. And I hadn't even started blowing yet. By Friday morning, he was spiraling. Subtly, but unmistakably. I watched him open and close the same kitchen drawer twice, like he'd forgotten what he was looking for. He asked where I'd left the charger he always used, even though it was in the same outlet it had always been. He spilled coffee grounds on the counter and didn't wipe them, just stared at the mess, then walked away. I was careful not to mirror his energy. I kept my tone neutral. Movements calm. I asked if he had any plans for the day. He said he might go, take a few meetings, but didn't elaborate. Anything interesting? I asked lightly. He shrugged. Nothing final yet. Final. Strange choice of word. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a while, letting the quiet settle. I hadn't said or done anything concrete yet. No accusations, no ultimatums, just a few vague comments and a shift in behavior. And already, he was starting to fold inward. That afternoon, I withdrew $200 from my personal account. I didn't need the cash. I just wanted to see it in my wallet. Proof that not everything was shared. That not everything could be touched. When he got home, he brought flowers. Again. Same grocery store bouquet, same brand of wine he thought I liked. He set them on the counter and said, "Thought you could use something pretty after the week you've had." I thanked him, put the flowers in a vase, poured the wine, sat with him in the living room while he talked about an opportunity that had just come up. Some contact he'd met through one of my father's colleagues. "Total coincidence," he said, eyes gleaming. "Didn't even know the guy was connected to your family until halfway through the conversation." Of course. "And now?" I asked. He smiled. "He's interested in hearing more. Wants to do coffee next week." I nodded. "Sounds promising. Think your dad would mind if I dropped his name? Just casually?" There it was again. The script. The layering. Say it lightly enough and maybe it won't sound like exploitation. "Depends on the context," I said. He laughed. "Right. Gotta be smart about it." I watched him sip his wine. His hands were steady again. Whatever nervous energy he'd carried in the morning had faded. He thought he was back in control, but I'd seen the shift, and I wasn't going to forget it. Saturday morning, he suggested brunch. I agreed. I wanted to see how far he'd take it, how much charm he could summon while standing on a sinking deck. At the restaurant, he was all smiles, flirting with the server just enough to appear confident, not inappropriate, telling me about the couple next to us. They've been arguing the whole time, you can tell. He always noticed other people's tension, never his own. Over coffee, he leaned forward and said, "I was thinking, maybe we should start fresh with a new joint account. Something just for investments, separate from household stuff." I tilted my head. "Why?" "Cleaner that way. Less overlap. Gives us both more clarity." He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was offering transparency. "You don't think the one we have now works?" "It works," he said quickly. "I just think we're at a point where we should be more strategic." Strategic. Every word he used lately sounded like it came from a manual. That night, I started my own strategy. I backed up all financial documents I had access to, tax returns, loan records, the joint account history. I didn't dig into his devices. I didn't need to. The information he'd already given me voluntarily was enough. Sunday, he was restless again. Asked if I wanted to go for a drive. I said no. He paced, pretended to clean, checked his phone every 10 minutes, asked 3 times if I'd spoken to my parents recently. "Not since last week," I told him. "Why?" "No reason, just wondered if they'd said anything about that restructuring you mentioned." I shrugged. "Not really. Just that things are shifting." He nodded, lips tight. That night, he came into the bedroom later than usual. I pretended to be asleep. He stood in the doorway for a while. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, like he was about to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he got up and walked out. I waited a full minute before opening my eyes. The sound of a man unraveling wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just the silence after a lie stopped working. By Monday, the panic had set in. Not dramatic panic, nothing shouted or thrown. Just the kind that hums under the surface, distorting everything. He started sending me texts during the day, more than usual. Not sweet or flirty, but overly attentive. "What are you up to?" "Thinking about you. Let me know if you need anything." I replied when I felt like it. Short answers. No emojis. I wasn't being cold. I just didn't feel the need to play along anymore. By the 3rd message, he sent a voice note. "You've been quiet today. Everything good?" His voice was careful, soft, the kind of tone people use when they're afraid something's slipping through their fingers. That night, he showed up at my office. No warning, just appeared in the lobby holding coffee and a bag of pastries from a cafe I used to like. "Figured you could use a break," he said, trying to sound casual, but his eyes were scanning me, searching for clues. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah, just missed you." I forced a smile. "Thanks for the coffee." He lingered longer than he should have, then kissed me goodbye. Not on the cheek or forehead, on the lips, deliberately, like he needed the staff to see it, like he needed witnesses. At home that evening, he cooked. Again. 3 nights in a row. He even bought candles I hadn't used in months. Tried to recreate a dinner we had years ago on a random rainy night. "Remember this?" he asked, pointing at the pasta. I nodded. "You added too much garlic that time." He smiled, but I saw the strain in it. After dinner, he brought up the idea of taking a few days off together. Just us. Disconnect from everything. Go somewhere quiet. He kept saying quiet like it was a promise. Or a solution. I said maybe. Then went upstairs. Alone. I watched his reflection in the hallway mirror as he stood by the sink, drying dishes with more force than necessary. By Wednesday, the flowers returned. This time, delivered to my office. Bigger, flashier. A handwritten note that read, "Just because you deserve the world." It didn't feel romantic. It felt like pressure. My coworker smiled when she saw them. "He's really putting in effort, huh?" I just nodded. The next morning, he asked if I wanted to look at properties. "Not to move now," he clarified. "Just to see what's out there. Dream a little." I asked why. He hesitated, then said, "It's good to have vision." But I saw it for what it was. He was trying to secure something, redirect the conversation to a future that depended on him. Thursday night, I tested something new. I mentioned, casually while scrolling through my phone, that my family might be scaling back on a few investments, that my dad was becoming more private, less inclined to discuss numbers. He didn't react right away. But later, I caught him standing in the hallway with his phone, whispering again. I didn't catch the words, but his tone was tight, urgent. Friday morning, he brought me breakfast in bed. He hadn't done that since our first year. He sat beside me, watched me eat like I might disappear. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "We should talk more. Really talk. I feel like we've been drifting a little." I set the tray aside. "What do you want to talk about?" "Just everything. Us, our future, how we're doing." "How do you think we're doing?" He swallowed. "I don't know. Sometimes you seem far away." "Do I?" He reached for my hand. "I don't want to lose what we've built." I let him hold it. Let him say the things he thought would fix it. But I didn't return them. I just listened, because it wasn't about fixing anymore. It was about watching him realize he was losing. That night, he cried. It wasn't loud or messy, just a few silent tears while he sat on the couch, pretending to scroll through something on his phone. I didn't ask why. I didn't offer comfort. He didn't try to explain. He just wiped his face and kept pretending. And for once, I think he knew I saw it. By Saturday morning, something had shifted inside me. The notebook I'd been keeping, quietly, methodically, was nearly full. Dates, behaviors, small inconsistencies. Every entry was a step back toward clarity. And now, looking at the pattern spread across weeks of careful observation, I knew I couldn't keep pretending much longer. He made breakfast again. Too much food, too many questions. "Do you want to go for a walk later? Should we book that trip next weekend? Have you talked to your mom recently?" "No," I said to the last one. "Why?" "Just wondering," he replied. "You've been quiet with them lately." I hadn't been quiet with them. I'd been thinking about what I would say when I was ready. That afternoon, I made a decision. I called my parents and asked if I could come over. "Just to talk," I said, "about something important." When I arrived, they were waiting in the kitchen, concern written across their faces. I sat down and took a breath. "I need to tell you something about him," I said. "About our marriage." I explained what I'd overheard in the phone call. The words he'd used, the tone, the casual way he'd discussed our relationship as a financial arrangement. I kept my voice steady, factual. No tears, no anger, just the truth. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. 2 weeks. "And you're certain about what you heard?" "Completely." He nodded slowly. "What do you want to do?" I appreciated that he didn't try to fix it or minimize it. He just asked what I needed. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I wanted you to know, before I decide anything." My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We're here for whatever you need." Driving home, I felt lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. That evening, I suggested dinner out. I needed to test something, to see if he could still perform when I wasn't actively giving him the responses he was used to. He brightened immediately. "Really? Where do you want to go?" "Somewhere nice," I said. "Your choice." He chose the steakhouse. Of course. At dinner, he was animated, almost giddy, talking about plans for the summer, ideas for redecorating the guest room, a business concept he'd been refining. He ordered wine without asking what I wanted. Halfway through the meal, I decided to ask a simple question. "What would you do if my family's financial situation changed?" I asked casually, cutting into my salmon. He paused mid-chew. "What do you mean? If the trust were restructured, or if my dad decided to step back from certain investments? What would that mean for your plans?" He set down his fork. "Why are you asking?" "Just curious." He studied my face for a moment, then forced a smile. "It wouldn't change anything. I mean, yeah, some opportunities might look different, but that's not why I'm here." "No? Of course not." He reached across the table for my hand. I'm here because I love you. I let him take my hand but didn't squeeze back. That's good to know, I said. But his eyes had changed. The easy confidence from earlier in the evening was gone, replaced by something more careful, more calculated. When we got home, he was quiet. He said he had some emails to catch up on and disappeared into his office. I could hear him on the phone later, voice low, door closed. I didn't try to listen. I didn't need to. I'd already seen enough. That night, I lay in bed while he worked late. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the conversation at dinner, how quickly his expression had shifted when I mentioned my family's money, how his first concern had been about opportunities rather than about my family's well-being. I thought about the phone call that had started all of this, the casual cruelty in his voice when he'd called our marriage awful, the laugh when he'd called me clueless, and I realized I'd been asking myself the wrong question. It wasn't whether I could forgive him, it was whether I wanted to spend another day pretending I didn't know who he really was. The answer was simple. I didn't. By Sunday afternoon, the decision had taken root. There was no big emotional climax, no moment of rage or screaming into a mirror, just a steady, cold clarity. I was done pretending. He suggested dinner again, this time at home. Said he wanted to cook for me, something special. Just us, he said. No distractions. I said yes. He spent the afternoon marinating chicken, chopping herbs like he was auditioning for some glossy version of himself. He lit candles, set the table with folded napkins and the wine glasses we only used when my parents visited. You look beautiful, he said when I came downstairs. I said thank you. He served the food with a flourish, made a toast to new beginnings. I raised my glass but didn't drink. We talked. About nothing. Weather, a neighbor's new car, a friend from college he ran into last week. I let him guide the conversation, let him spin the illusion a little longer. Then, while he was clearing the plates, I said, I want to talk about the call. He froze with his back to me, his hands still, gripping the edge of the sink. What call? I waited until he turned around, his face carefully blank. The one you forgot to hang up. His mouth opened, then closed. He began. I heard everything, I said calmly. Every word. He looked at the floor, then at me. It wasn't what you think. You said our marriage was awful. I was venting. Having a bad day. You said you're only with me because of my family's money. I was being stupid, I didn't mean it. You know how guys talk when they're frustrated. You called me clueless. His jaw clenched. It was a joke. A bad one. I was angry about something else. You said I'd never see it coming. The silence stretched between us. He sat down across from me, leaning forward. Look, I've made mistakes. I've gotten comfortable with your family's generosity. Maybe I've taken advantage of that. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. Doesn't it? No, he said firmly. I married you because I love you. Everything else is just circumstantial. I studied his face, the earnest expression he was trying so hard to maintain. When we first met, I said slowly, how long did it take you to ask about my family? He blinked. What do you mean? First date? Second date. When did you bring up what my father did for work? I don't remember exactly. Second date, I said. Over coffee. You asked what my parents did, and when I told you about the business, you got very interested. Started asking follow-up questions. That's normal. People ask about families. You researched my father before our third date. I remember because you mentioned an article about him that had just been published. One you couldn't have found unless you were looking. His face flushed slightly. I was interested in your life. That's what people do when they're dating. Is it? He stood up, agitated now. You're twisting everything, making it sound calculated when it wasn't. Then explain the pattern. What pattern? The way you always suggest expensive places when my parents are paying. The way you get quiet when I mention budgeting our own money. The way every business idea you have involves my father's connections. Those are just practical considerations. For who? He ran his hands through his hair. You're being unfair. You're taking normal relationship dynamics and making them sound sinister. Normal? Yes, normal. Couples leverage each other's strengths. They build on what each person brings to the table. And what do I bring? He hesitated. Just for a moment. You bring yourself, your intelligence, your kindness, my family's money. That's not what I was going to say. But it's what you were thinking. He sank back into his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to convince you. You can't, I said quietly. Because I heard what you really think, in your own words. When you thought no one was listening, he was quiet for a long time. Then, what happens now? I think you should stay somewhere else for a while. For how long? I don't know yet. He nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this. And us? There is no us. Not anymore. He looked at me across the flickering candles, the carefully prepared dinner now cold between us. I never meant for you to get hurt, he said. I know, I replied. You never meant for me to find out. When I went upstairs, I could hear him moving around the kitchen, cleaning up, putting away the fantasy dinner that was supposed to fix things. I sat on the bed in the dark, listening to the quiet sounds of a man finally understanding that some lies are too big to survive discovery. He hadn't apologized for deceiving me, only for getting caught. He left the next morning, no suitcase, just a backpack and his laptop. Said he'd figure something out, said it wasn't permanent. I just want to give you space, he added, standing in the doorway like he was still waiting for permission to come back. I didn't say anything. After the door closed, I locked it behind him. Not dramatically, just a quiet turn of the bolt. Then I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the silence. He texted twice that afternoon. I'm sorry. I still love you. I didn't reply. By evening, the messages escalated. Can we talk? I can explain better in person. You're shutting me out, and that's not fair. It wasn't anger yet, just desperation dressed as sincerity. The next day, a flower delivery arrived. White roses, a note tucked inside, still hoping for us. They went straight into the trash. He started calling after that. I didn't block him, yet. I wanted to hear what he'd say when I didn't answer. Voicemails piled up, calm at first, then emotional. One ended with, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what we had. Another, I made mistakes, but we can fix them. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. On Thursday, he left a letter in the mailbox. 4 pages, handwritten, his version of a confession. He said he was lost when we met, that he admired my strength, my ambition, that it intimidated him, that it also drew him in. He wrote about his failures, career setbacks, insecurities he never shared, how he felt less than around my family. He didn't mention money until the last paragraph. Maybe I leaned on your family too much. Maybe I thought it would be easier with their help, but I never loved you less because of it. That was the closest he got to admitting anything. No acknowledgement of the lies, of the plan, of the conversation he never expected me to hear. Just soft phrasing and emotional framing. As if the real betrayal was me not understanding him. He ended the letter with, let me prove myself to you. Let me show you who I really am. I folded the pages neatly and placed them in the back of the drawer with everything else. Because I already knew who he really was. And no performance now could change it. On Friday, he called my mother. I don't know what he said, but she texted me afterward. He reached out. Just wanted you to know. I didn't engage. Then, later that night, he called again. I let it ring. Then he sent a voice note. I keep thinking about Nashville, he said. That weekend we got caught in the storm and ended up staying in that little motel. You were so cold, and I gave you my jacket. You fell asleep on my shoulder. That wasn't fake. None of that was fake. His voice broke. He sniffled. Let a silence stretch before whispering, please don't let this be the end. But it was. Because those memories he kept referencing, those flashes of tenderness, weren't lies. That was the most painful part. They were real moments offered by a man who never intended to stay unless it paid off. By Sunday, the tone changed. He texted, I think you're making a mistake. Then, we had something real, even if parts of it were messy. Then finally, you're going to regret this when the anger wears off. There it was. The pivot, from remorse to blame. I didn't respond. I just forwarded the messages to my lawyer. We were already in the process. Slow, quiet, legal, not public yet. But the groundwork was there. My parents had been measured and calm throughout. My father sent one message after reviewing the paperwork. Proud of how you're handling this. Let us know if you need anything else. I didn't need anything. Not from them. Not from him. What I needed now was silence. Space. Time to remember how it felt to breathe without being observed. He tried one last time the following Tuesday. Showed up at my office. The receptionist buzzed my desk. There's someone here asking to speak with you. I looked up from my monitor. Tell him I'm in a meeting. I didn't need to see his face. He'd already shown me everything. The papers were served on a Wednesday. There was no announcement, no dramatic handoff. Just a courier with a neutral expression, handing over an envelope with my name and his. I knew he'd be at the apartment he was staying in, one he'd borrowed from a friend while giving me space. I waited. That night, he didn't text, didn't call, The silence felt different this time. Less calculated, more like retreat. Thursday morning, my lawyer called. "He's lawyered up," she said. "Standard firm. Nothing aggressive so far." "What did he say?" "He's not contesting the separation, but he's requesting mediation. Says he wants to protect what's fair." I didn't ask what he meant by fair. I already knew. That afternoon, I sat in a conference room while my attorney went over a list of items he was requesting clarity on. Joint account balances, shared property, business-related contributions, no mention of love, of reconciliation, of fixing anything. Just numbers. He's trying to walk away with what he thinks he's entitled to. My lawyer said, "You ready for this?" "Yes," I said, "but I want everything documented." And so we documented. The joint account showed irregular withdrawals going back almost 6 months, transfers to a second personal account we hadn't previously known about. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Patterns of movement, attempts to hide. One of the transfers had been labeled consulting support, but the company it referenced didn't exist. Another had gone directly to a private account linked to a woman's name I didn't recognize, but my lawyer did some digging. College girlfriend, still in the same state, recently unemployed, and he'd sent her money. Not once, not twice, 7 times. Amounts ranging from 300 to a little over 1,000, always spaced weeks apart. "That's not charity," my lawyer said. "That's maintenance." We included it all. The fake business names, the mismatched expense reports, the sudden surge of interest in financial literacy startups that seemed to exist only on paper. My lawyer raised a brow. "He's either very sloppy or very confident you wouldn't notice." "Both," I said. When he finally responded through his legal team, the tone had shifted again. He wasn't denying the transactions, just contextualizing them. He claimed he'd supported me emotionally, that our lifestyle had been mutually agreed upon, that any financial benefits he received were incidental, not manipulative. But the documents told another story. And for the first time since this began, I felt angry. Not heartbreak, not sadness. Just the raw heat of having been quietly used. He hadn't even tried to keep the story straight. He just assumed I wouldn't look. We scheduled the formal mediation 2 weeks later. He walked in wearing a blazer, smiling like we were there to negotiate a misunderstanding. I didn't smile back. The mediator outlined the terms. My lawyer laid out our findings. His lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The paper trail was louder than anything I could have said. At one point, he looked over at me and said, "I never meant for it to get this far." And I just said, "You meant it to go far enough." He didn't speak again for the rest of the meeting. We didn't finish that day. Too much to sort through. But by the second session, the terms were clear. He'd walk away without contesting the dissolution. No claim on family assets. No share of anything tied to the trust. He asked to keep a watch I'd given him on our first anniversary. I said no. He didn't fight it. By the end of the month, the filings were complete. Nothing public yet, but official enough. My name restored to its original form. Access to all financial systems reset. All joint accounts closed. Phone plans separated. Keys collected. It took 3 months total. No drawn-out court battle, no public scandal. Just the slow, deliberate dismantling of a lie. The woman he'd been sending money to? She showed up in the financial records but never contacted me. I didn't need to speak with her. I already knew what kind of story he'd told her too. Something about being misunderstood, pressured, trapped in a marriage that didn't reflect who he really was. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was just another version of the script. Either way, I didn't care. By the time the divorce was finalized, I'd moved into a smaller place. Something mine. Nothing fancy. Just quiet. I changed my number. He sent one final email. No subject line. Just a short message. "I never stopped loving you." I read it once, then deleted it. Not out of anger, out of relief. Some people say closure comes with forgiveness. I disagree. For me, closure came in silence. In the stillness of a house where I didn't have to watch my words or measure his moods. In waking up without dread. In knowing I didn't have to explain myself to someone who had never really been listening. I didn't tell many people what had happened. Just my family, my sister, a few close friends. Most others filled in their own blanks. That was fine. Let them. I started working longer hours not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I rediscovered what it felt like to be proud of myself, not as part of a couple, not as someone's wife, but just me. There were bad days. Days when I questioned everything. Wondered how I could have missed it. Wondered if that version of love was all I'd ever been trained to recognize. But those days came less often. And when they did, I didn't fight them. I let them move through me like weather. And then I kept going. I donated the dress I wore to that steakhouse dinner. The one where I first realized I couldn't pretend anymore. I threw out the wine glasses we only used for show. I replaced the silverware set we'd picked together. Small things, petty maybe, but they made space. I went to therapy. I told the truth out loud. Heard myself say the words, "He used me." And my therapist didn't flinch, didn't rush to soften it. She just asked, "And what did that teach you about yourself?" I didn't answer right away, but I kept going back. My parents were exactly what I needed. Calm, grounded, not vengeful. My father never once said, "I told you so." He just helped me get the documents in order, gave me a quiet nod when everything was finalized. My mother cried once, quietly, over coffee. "You deserved better," she said. "I know," I replied. And I did. As for him, he disappeared the way people like him do. Quietly, with dignity rehearsed for an audience that no longer existed. Last I heard, he moved to another city, tried starting a new consultancy, rebranded himself online. Same smile, different captions. One of my old college friends messaged me. "Isn't this your ex?" she asked, sending me a link to his new website. I didn't open it. I just replied, "Not anymore. I don't know who he's dating now. I don't want to know. But I can imagine the script, the charm, the part where he presents himself as someone who almost had it all, if not for some cruel misunderstanding. I don't need to warn anyone. Life has a way of catching up with people like him. And anyway, he's not my responsibility anymore. I've built a life that no longer circles around someone else's ambition. I wake up, make my own coffee, take walks just because I want to. I don't check anyone's schedule before making plans. I don't filter myself to keep someone comfortable. One night, a few months after the divorce was finalized, I found the notebook I used to keep. The one where I'd written down his behaviors, the patterns, the lies. I read a few pages, then I threw it in the trash. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't need it anymore. The proof had served its purpose. The real transformation wasn't about exposing him. It was about reclaiming myself. I was no longer the woman being managed like an investment. I was no longer the wife someone chose for access. I was someone who saw the truth, held her ground, and walked away. That was the story worth remembering. Epilogue, where everyone ended up. Him. He moved to another city, rebranded himself as a resilient entrepreneur with a personal growth narrative. His social media is full of polished captions about setbacks and reinvention. He never admitted what he did. Still curates his life for an invisible audience, still chasing validation in borrowed language. The woman from college, she never reached out. She likely went on with her life. Whether he's still part of it or not, I'll never know. The money she received was part of his long-term plan. But like most of his plans, it didn't survive exposure. My parents, still present, still steady. Careful with their words, not because they doubt me, but because they trust I can carry my own weight now. Quietly proud, fiercely protective, but from a respectful distance. Me, free. Not flawless, not entirely healed, but whole. For the first time in years, I'm not waiting for someone else's next move. I'm not anticipating the turn in someone else's mood. I'm not performing, I'm just living, and that's more than enough.